Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Life in the Red podcast. Luke Mullen here, as usual. Today, joined by the return of Jordan McAlpine.
The grand return.
Yes, indeed. Your fans have been calling for it. They keep blowing up my DMs. They're saying, "Where's Jordan?"
I can't blame them. The sink didn't ship too much the first time, so let's run it back this time, right?
Absolutely. Well, we had to bring you on, of course, to get your insight on the hoops. Very busy hoops season underway. And in that regard, it's just a very busy time for Nebraska athletics in general. Football recruiting trail, we'll touch on that here at the end of the episode. Basketball, wrestling's going on too, by the way. But of course, today, as we record this, the end of the road for the volleyball team, end in the Sweet 16, lost to Oregon in 5 sets, which was a great match, by the way, but a little bit heartbreaking because they had their chances to kill it off in the 4th set.
Well, and especially with the expectations of this group.
Yeah.
I mean, right up the road with it being in Omaha this year for the end of the road, I guess you could say, comes up short for them, and you take it to 5 sets, obviously. Like you said yourself, it's heartbreaking. They go on that run there at the end, too little, too late, and I know deep down for John Cook and that group, I don't know if I'd go as far to say obviously it is disappointing. It's not a lost year by any means with it. You go to the Sweet 16 again, you have the success they do. I want to say they lost 6 times during the year total, but obviously falling short of where this group wants to, and it'll be an interesting offseason to see where they go from here. So
yeah, I think it's kind of a testament to how spoiled they are with success, the Nebraska volleyball program, that Sweet 16 is like, crash out of the tournament. Like, I mean, from pretty much any other program, that's a great year. So
you talk about the difference of standards in the athletic department, where you got one program just trying to make it back to a bowl game, and you got another one that's not happy with making it to the Sweet 16. I guess that's all she wrote for how it's going right now.
Yeah, so. that's why people say it's a volleyball school now. So, but definitely want to jump to hoops because this will be a big part of the next couple months. Women's basketball and men's basketball both underway and both picking up some big wins here early in the year. So let's just start on the women's side of things. You look at back-to-back wins and 5 of their last 6 after 3-2 start, and a couple, games early in the season. The loss to Drake in particular, I think people were very surprised at, but they seem to have turned it around last couple.
Well, and that Drake loss is the big one. Both programs are 7-3 right now. The women are off to that 2-0 start in Big Ten play, but Creighton loss, Virginia Tech loss. You losing to 2 ranked teams, especially playing at Creighton with as much was on the line. Both the teams were in the top 25 at the time. But the Drake game, just from start to finish, just that they didn't have it in it at the same time. I mean, thankfully they have bounced back from it. But when you're sitting at 3-2 early for a team that has tournament expectations, it made you kind of wonder where this team was at and how they were going to respond to that start. And obviously last night with Wisconsin, I mean, you couldn't have scripted a much better start to finish domination of the game, I would say, especially with Jaz Shelley, 31 points on it. So
definitely. And I mean, you look at the depth that they have so far, and last year I think that was kind of one of the issues, and it seems to be a little bit better this year also. I mean, it's worth noting that Sam Hybe, you think she's going to be out for the year, and she's back in the fold too. So that's a big pickup for the team to have her out there.
Well, and last night, speaking of the injury bug, I mean, they were without Isabella Bourne, who through the first 8 games was one of their biggest playmakers down low, especially with Jazz getting her the ball and going to work. You got the little Australian connection going there. But, I mean, Sam, at the start of the year, they were able to overcome it. Now the question is, and obviously the status of Izzy's up in the air, if this is a long-term issue, how are they going to bounce back and keep going here?
For sure. But, I mean, you look at the start to conference play, which I always think is kind of interesting. The
split schedule?
Yeah, the Big Ten, play 2 conference games, have 3-4 non-conference or whatever. But, like you said, Jaz Shelley, 31 points. It was a 30-plus or about a 30-point win as well. So, I mean, that's a pretty good way to start things off.
Yeah, and especially at home. I mean, they've been good at PBA this season, and obviously you start conference play, that momentum. Now, granted, you're going to have that Christmas break, like you touched on. You've got the split schedule, but you beat a good Wisconsin team right off the bat there. Hopefully it can really be a good shot in the arm of confidence for this team going forward.
Yeah, without a doubt, and we'll stay tuned to all the women's team action, of course. But, Jordan, you've been mostly focusing on the men's basketball team, and, going into the year, I think it was everyone knows it's a big year for Fred Hoiberg and this team. Some people saying this might be his most talented roster yet. I mean, we're only 10 games into the year, but do you get that sense of things?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think there are a lot of question marks with this team coming into the year. You look at the transfer portal, you
Yeah.
add Sam Griesel, Emmanuel Bandamel, Jawan Gary. The hope is that these kids are going to come in not only on the court, but change the culture, help bring that group together, which, I mean, by all indications, they have so far. And from Fred's standpoint, the verdict's still out. I mean, it's December 8th. We got a long way to go in the college basketball season here, but you get that signature win against Creighton. You've got a Purdue team coming to town this weekend that if you can somehow pull off that upset and knock off a couple more in Big Ten play, I mean, like I said, there's a long way to go with this team, and they've just, last night, different story, but coming off of 3 straight wins, there are some things that want to give you that sense of belief, but we'll really see how they put it together here. And I do think, I mean, the pressure that, obviously Fred, but the team as a whole coming into this season, you do have to feel that. You've got a mix of the portal kids, you've got Derek Walker coming back, you've got this experience that it's there for this team to go on a run, and you hear him talk about, especially last week, Derek Walker's going into this stretch of 3 straight games against top 10 teams that we got to focus on us, we got to handle what we can. They beat Creighton, they go on the road. Now coming into Purdue this Saturday to close out that stretch, I mean, this will probably be their biggest test of the season so far, just strictly based off the opponent. But if they can, like I said, if they can pull this off, big if, let's throw that in there. But if they can, going into the rest of Big Ten play, the team's got to be at least feeling good going into it. So
Yeah. I mean, if we wind back the clock a little bit and, look how the season has progressed, I think the big question was, can they string wins together? Can they beat the teams that they have to? And then, can they be competitive against the teams that they're not favored in? So, I mean, you look at the start of the year, beat Maine, beat UNO, and then the really rough kind of second half collapse there against St. John's. But first, I got a question here. UNO, that the athletic department, they keep going, they keep trying to call it Omaha. I've always felt it was UNO. I mean, what you went there?
Yeah.
I mean, what did you think?
I hear both ends of that spectrum. I mean, I get on the Omaha side of it, more of the marketing side of that.
Sure.
When you've got Omaha playing out in the East Coast and there's a team with UNO across its chest, it's kind of hard to link that to the school. That I do get that. Obviously, you've got some of the traditional purist UNO fans, if you will, that grew up around it, especially on the hockey side, which is what I had been accustomed to the last few years, that it's UNO through and through. Now, personally, I'm fine either way with it. I kind of think they're interchangeable with it, but with the Omaha aspect of it, I guess that's where I would lean more so towards, and I do get the intention behind it, and at least so far, you've seen that athletic department the last few years go through so much of a shift that it seems like it's been for the better. So
yeah, just a little sidebar, something that keeps irking me all the time, because like I said, I mean, I grew up knowing it as UNO, and last few years, it's all been Omaha. So
the basketball program too. I mean, kind of a different note, but you get Chris Crutchfield in there as the head coach of that program. It seems like that momentum is going in the right direction for him. I mean, simple stuff like that, you wonder how big of a difference in terms of recruiting and getting your name out there as a school in the national standpoint, especially being a Summit League school. You need as much help in some of those situations as you can get. That, I mean, I like I said, long story short, I get the intention behind it, and I get where they're going with it.
Yeah,
so
branding matters, especially in this
2022 college sports. Yes,
without a doubt. So, I mean, back to the men's basketball team. Sorry about that segue.
Hey,
but
that's what our fans came here for, right?
That's right. This is the only content that you get when Jordan's on the pod. So, that loss against St. John's. I mean, first half they were very strong. Second half, just completely different, and they really needed to bounce back, beat Arkansas Pine Bluff, which is not a great opponent, but they needed that.
Yeah, and I guess 2 parts of that. One, with the non-con, each year under Fred, they've had kind of that trap game, if you will. I know it was Western Illinois last year, that at least to get through the start of this season, I know they were the 2-0, which became 3-1. There was St. John in between. To take care of business in those games, I think was good, especially for this group with the new faces coming in, to get off on the right foot. But you go back to that St. John's game, it after the Creighton game, the big question was what if? What if Derek Walker was in that game?
That's
You
right.
see the impact.
Yeah.
Nebraska goes into the half. I mean, I don't think you could have scripted a much better first half for Nebraska. Obviously, the start of that game at St. John's was rocky back and forth, but you're going in with some momentum, some confidence. You're playing in a road building. You come out of the second half, and on the opposite end of that, I don't think they could have imagined a much worse start to that. And then once St. John's got rolling, inside, especially at the paint, there was nothing Nebraska could do to stop them, and which goes back to Derek Walker.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we'll talk about it here in a second, but that just completely changes the complexion of that team with the way they're able to run their offense, the way they're able to control the paint. And St. John's took advantage where they needed to, and obviously Nebraska walked out of there with a loss. So it's done it in the past, and at least up until last night, this team had responded really well. So.
Sure. And I mean, that St. John's game also really important because that was the first power conference, team that they'd played.
Yep. First road test of the year too.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you take care of business against these mid-major, low-major teams, but can you beat the power conference teams? And they had a few of those games, over Thanksgiving, lost to Oklahoma, lost to Memphis before beating a relatively poor Florida State team, compared to their usual standards. But those 3 games, back to back to back, teams love playing these because they give you that experience, especially if you're looking to be a team, conference tournament, NCAA tournament, going to need to be able to play those games back to back. But, also some different looks, different games that they had there. What would you kind of make of the Thanksgiving Invitational?
Well, and to go to before they even went to Orlando there, I know Fred Hoiberg talked a bunch about that was, and you just said at that stretch, you've got 3 games in 4 days. This is the first true test for this team to see how they would handle that type of workload, that environment. Obviously, it kind of came full circle this past week and still ongoing now with Creighton, Indiana, Purdue back to back to back.
Mm-hmm.
Early on in the season, though, and I mean, let's be real, even after that Florida State game, you got to kind of take that with a grain of salt. We're not talking about a world-beating Florida State team by any stretch of the imagination, but just to come back out, especially with that St. John's game, and put together a really dominant second half was probably the biggest takeaway from that weekend. And you hope, obviously, it's just one win in the grand scheme of things, but early in the season, not only on the court, but a weekend like that can really bring that group together, mesh them. A win is a great thing, obviously, just to give them that confidence and sense of belief heading into it. But at least in hindsight, you kind of started to see a turning point with the team coming back home after that. And obviously, a 1-2 start or 1-2 finish in that weekend isn't what you want, but at the same time, just to come out of that with some type of momentum, I think will really serve this team well heading down the stretch here. So
yeah, I mean, I think just looking at the way that they played before that, and then the way that they've been locking in on defense afterwards, it was, it's maybe a little like too simple to say something clicked, but it was like they finally picked up a little bit of that steam, a little bit of that traction, to get going. And big time home win over Boston College. Again, power conference team, probably not the top of the ACC by any means, but 20-point win at home. I mean, that's exactly what the doctor ordered, right?
Yeah, and I mean, they scored 51 points in the second half of that Boston College game. But on your point about the defense, it's kind of funny. When they were in Orlando, the Saturday off day they had between the Memphis and Florida State game there, they actually changed some stuff schematically, but especially defensively in their hotel, and put some different packages in place, which obviously made a difference in that Florida State game. And you come into Boston College, it's close at the half, and right away it's okay. Here we go again, going back to that St. John game meaning, and just firing on all cylinders out of the half with it. I want to say they shot 68% or something close to that in the second half there, and really started to control the paint, which started to set the trend for the next 3 games there with BC, and then leading into Creighton with controlling the boards. And obviously defensively, we'll talk about it more here, but you look at Vanderbilt and Gary, they got the black shirts for a reason after that. So
for sure. And I mean, that Boston College game, Keisei Tominaga, 23 points. Our Chris Basnett was chucking laptops, pounding Mountain Dews. That's his favorite player, Tominaga, by the way.
Ripping the jerseys off the shelf everywhere you could after that one.
People were going crazy, both here and, of course, overseas, his loyal fan base. But the Boston College game sets up the big rivalry game.
Yeah.
The game that Creighton has dominated. Creighton got a top 10 team, national championship aspirations, probably the most talented team that Greg McDermott has had at Creighton, and they put up a stinker. And you could say all you want about, Creighton, having played these great teams, the week before, shooting probably one of their worst performances of the year. But at the same time, I mean, Nebraska harassed them all game long.
Yeah, and especially, I mean, on paper, you look at it, Creighton won 10 of 11. Nebraska hadn't won in Omaha since 2004, and their last regular season win wasn't since 1995. I mean, everything was there from a mental standpoint coming into that game to be defeated before that game even tips off. And I mean, right away, you got to give Nebraska credit for the way they handled it, especially the first 10 minutes of that first half.
Yeah.
Just punching back anytime Creighton had an answer, kind of sucking the life out of that building. And especially, I mean, you talk about Creighton's talent. You look at a Ryan Kalkbrenner, Nembhard. I mean, matchup-wise coming into that game, you thought right away Nebraska was going to have headaches in terms of matching up. And that goes back to Derek Walker once again with the way that they were able to really set the tone for the rest of the game. They come into halftime, and I want to say Creighton, 5 minutes or so into the start of the second half, had it down to a 1-point game. And just right after that, Nebraska really started to pull away and take over. And, I mean, Sam Griesel's the story of that one.
Absolutely.
Derek Walker also. But a guy, and Fred's talked about it this week, Juwan Gary, you really have started to see the impact that he's had there. And especially in terms of defensively around the glass. I know we jinxed it going into last night. They had out-rebounded 6 straight opponents. They saw that stretch end last night there. But they really took it to Creighton, all things considered, in that game.
Yeah, I mean, your point about Juwan Gary, to me, he kind of feels like the all-around player, the guy who you're not saying, oh, go out there and score 20 or do whatever. It's just, hustle, play good defense, make a few shots, make the right passes. I mean, he does all that stuff really well.
Yeah, and also to go back to their defense, and I mean, you said it yourself, there were stretches that game that I don't think Creighton could have fallen out of a boat and hit water with some of the shots they were taking. But it's Nebraska's defense kept everything to the perimeter.
Yeah.
They didn't really get a chance to get comfortable in their transition going up and down the court with it. And then when they did, Gary and Bandit were right there to stop them. And whether it was blocks, forcing turnovers, I mean, box score-wise, there had to be a lot of happy faces on that Nebraska bench looking down at the stat sheet at the end of that game there. So
Definitely. And, after a performance like that, there's always going to be a little bit of, I don't know, leveling out or,
the emotional hangover, as I lovingly say with it.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
And I mean, especially when you've got 2 more top 25 teams, to play in your next 2 games. So last night, 81-65, number 14 Indiana Hoosiers defeat Nebraska. Not as good shooting, not as good defense, but were there still those encouraging signs for you?
There were as the game went along, but to go back to it, the big thing is 90 minutes before tip-off when you find out your heart and soul player. And if there was anything the Creighton game really proved, it's how much that offense, obviously Derek's a big part of that, but how much at the top really runs through Sam. And from a leadership standpoint, he's kind of a glue guy with that team chemistry-wise. When you lose him, I mean, Nebraska's offense, they got down 10-2. It became 20-5 pretty early there. Never really looked comfortable. And, I mean, the starting 5 was mostly the same intact. I know Casey Tominaga goes in for Sam Griesel there. But just it didn't have the same flow or really function to it throughout the game, and they were never able to respond from that. So they did have a couple runs. Don't get me wrong, especially there in the second half. They did pull it within 7 twice, made it interesting. But Assembly Hall, talented Indiana team. Trace Jackson Davis did Trace Jackson Davis things.
Sure
he records
a
triple-double, the 3rd in Indiana's program history, and really made it tough life for Nebraska to get much going at the offensive end there.
Well, I'm going to pose a question. Usually during football season, we'd always do a Husker hot topic. This is a relatively hot topic, but fairly simple. Who do you think is more impactful, Derek Walker or Sam Griesel?
Oh, that's a good one.
Because they both have made such a big impact.
I would say in different aspects. On the court, I would lean towards Derek, just with the way you see teams having to kind of adjust away from the rim and avoid the pressure, and defensively too. Derek's been able to make an impact in terms of controlling the big guy. And, I mean, even Jackson Davis, yes, he does have the game that he does last night, but for Indiana's offense as a whole at times, Walker's impact was still able to shift around the stuff they were doing. I mean, Derek's first 2 games, he had back-to-back double-doubles. You see him.
Pretty good.
You put the shoulder into a guy and drive to the rim. There aren't many guys on Nebraska's roster that have that impact as Derek. Now, on the flip side of that with Sam, I mean, you look at the experience he brings in here from North Dakota State. You got that tournament pedigree. You've got the local aspect of it. He understands his program. I mean, just strictly from a culture guy. When you hear him speak at press conferences and throughout the week, it's no surprise he has the impact that he does in that locker room. So I know I'm giving you a little bit of a long-winded answer on both aspects of that, but I would say in different ways they impact the team, and they impact the team in different ways. But obviously at the same time, they're both really big pieces of this team on the floor. So
yeah. Personally, I would say Griesel, he's kind of like a floor general out there. I mean, he passes, he rebounds, he scores, he does it all. But at the same time, I mean, you look at how the team played before Derek was on the court and how they play now.
That's what makes it tough, especially going back. And Sam, too, at the same time. I mean, especially those first 2 games in Orlando, and St. John's as part of that, wasn't, and I think he'd be the first one to tell you, wasn't exactly the performance as he wanted. And at the same time, you see without Derek, it makes you wonder how much of an impact having Derek on the floor contributes to Sam being able to what he's been able to do these last few games. And especially that Creighton game, when you've got 2 threats. I mean, you see it last night. Indiana, in an essence, is able to really zone in and key on Derek, eliminate that threat. Whereas the Creighton game, you've got 2 guys going for it, that plus Bandemol, plus Gary, all these supplementary pieces. And even last night, C.J. Wilcher has a career-high 22 points heading into Big Ten play. If you can really get all these guys firing on all cylinders, well, you'll ask me this question again, and I'll have even more answers to throw at you. So.
No doubt. Well, they will need all those guys to be firing on all cylinders, as you said.
Saturday.
Up next, number 4, Purdue comes to town, 9-0, arguably the best team in the Big Ten. They're going to be a major contender this year as well, and they're off to a great start.
Yeah, and even last night, I mean, Fred said it himself on his post-game show, you go from different aspects of the high. You're coming off that emotional win, Creighton. You've got to put it in the rearview mirror coming into Indiana. Now how is this team going to respond? Obviously, they went through that in Orlando a little bit, bouncing back, but you've got a Purdue team, 9-0. I mean, a lot of people at this point have got to really think that they're the favorite or one of the favorites in the Big Ten coming into it. Home game, recruiting weekend for multiple sports going on, that everything is in place for Nebraska to really have the ability to bounce back. Now, at the same time, Purdue's not going to make that easy. So,
yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm glad you mentioned recruiting. That'll probably about do it for the hoops talk for now, because a lot has happened in football in the last 8 days since Amy and I sat here and recorded a
feels like 8 years at this rate.
Absolutely. I mean, the way that transfer portal and the early signing day have changed December. December is arguably the craziest month of college football, and games aren't even happening for the vast majority of it. So just want to recap a little bit of what happened on the football side of things. Decommitments, these are always going to be something that happens when a new coaching staff comes in place, just because guys have great relationships with the old assistant coaches, all sorts of reasons for these different players, but a few big ones in particular. Lincoln East wide receiver Malachi Coleman was among the first to decommit, and in particular, that's one because of Mickey Joseph. His status still uncertain, everything going through the legal system. Nebraska hasn't hired a wide receivers coach yet as well. So, I mean, that's a major thing to consider. Marion Miller, also wide receiver, decommitted from New Orleans, heavily recruited by Joseph. So those two make a lot of sense.
Well, in the relationship aspect of it, and you said it yourself there, but I mean, a lot of these kids in some of these situations are almost committing more to a coach than a school, just for that fit with obviously there's so many different factors that go into recruiting, but when you've got that comfortability, that familiarity with the guy, and especially Malachi, I mean, even when he committed here, all the writing was on the wall, how big of an impact Mickey Joseph had over the last few months with him. And you look at today, Syracuse is coming to talk to him, Tim Brewster from Colorado, that it's open season. It's college football free agency, essentially, with the transfer portal. But, I mean, you never say never with these kids. There's always that door open for them to come back. But at the same time, especially once Matt had just taken the job and so many assistants were still up in the air, these kids don't know what their immediate future is going to hold. Granted, you always have that option to come back, but if you dip your toe into the portal, you can see what else is out there for you.
Yeah, and I will note in particular for Malachi, he will be taking an official visit to Nebraska this weekend. Still working on building that relationship with Rule and the new coaching staff, but just with an eye towards, what are my other options?
Yeah.
And, looking at those other places.
And that position coach aspect of it does make it tough. And I mean, even, we'll talk about him in a second, but you look at a guy like an Ernest Hausman, that Barrett Ruud's impact, not only recruiting trail, but when you spend that year with him coaching you up, you get that comfortability. He's your guy, so to speak. But on the other end of that, you're going to have that coach that's going to be willing to go to bat for you. He's got a piece of the pie, obviously, since you're the one that recruited the kid. Now he's out the window. How's that new coach going to impact and fit into my game type of thing is what those kids have to go through their heads. So.
Yeah, for sure. And the other two decommitments, by the way, running back Arnold Barnes, very easy to see why this one happened. Brian Applewhite flipped him from Tulane to Nebraska, and now that Applewhite's no longer here, Barnes will be looking at his other options. And then arguably perhaps the biggest, most shocking one, Pierce tight end Ben Bramer decommitted from Nebraska, choosing to go to Iowa State instead. And this one was an interesting one, but I think from my perspective, it's easy to see why it happened. When you have a year and a half to build relationships, as he did with Scott Frost, Barrett Ruud, Sean Beckton, his position coach. I mean, he was the first commit in this 23 class. He committed 18 months ago. Those were the guys that he's been talking to. Also, Iowa State been making a late push, perhaps in the last year or so, just from a sense of building those relationships, talking, trying to get him out to campus for a visit. So Iowa State's been there. I think Nebraska was always his first choice over that period. But when you have that coaching staff change and suddenly you're looking at a coaching staff that you've been building these relationships with for over a year versus a week, really is where we are right now. I mean, that's why the decision was made to go to Iowa State.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head with that one, but it goes back to those two big words, comfortability and familiarity. Like, you're going through that process even though he was a Nebraska commit. The pen hadn't hit the paper yet, that Iowa State was still kind of looming in the shadows, if you will, and he did have that open communication at the same time. That, I mean, the new coaching staff comes in, there's a lot of question marks up in the air. I'm not entirely surprised by it, but at the same time, it leaves a dent just knowing how long he's been committed here. You've got the local aspect, a Nebraska kid, all the ties with it. I'll be interested to see how the rest of the class adjust accordingly to that. So.
Yeah, for sure. And on the flip side, a lot of new offers have been going out. And I do mean a lot. Yeah, not just, I mean, of course, the 2023 class is the focus right now, but there's a view towards the future. They have been offering 24, 25. And even today, I saw a 2026 quarterback. Kid's a freshman in high school, and he's getting all these scholarship offers. But hey, when you're a blue chipper in the making, I mean, that's
it's making us feel old when we see 2026 kids pop up.
That's right. But the one commitment that Nebraska has landed so far, Bay City, Texas athlete Bryce Turner, one of the nation's top sprinters, and a guy that most schools were looking at as a track and field athlete. Nebraska in particular had a conversation with him, offered him a partial track scholarship to run here. But as I got on the phone with him and got the chance to kind of talk about how it played out, basically he got a call from Nebraska, from his track coach saying, hey, would you be able to play football here? Are you willing to do that? And he said, oh, yeah. So they connected him with defensive backs coach Evan Cooper and basically offered him a scholarship. An hour later or whatever, he says, hey, I'm all in. So, just getting the chance to talk with him, I was like, you're such a good track athlete. I mean, were you always wanting to run track, or were you wanting to play football? And he said he wanted to play football, and this was the right opportunity for him.
Yeah, and we'll talk about another. Speaking of track athlete with Jalen Lloyd here locally. The athletic part of that obviously gives you options on the football field from a coaching staff standpoint. And to go back to the other thing you touched on, looking towards the future with Matt Rule and this staff starting to formalize and be in place here, it gives these kids a little bit more of a sense of security, if you will, of who's going to be here for the next few years compared to committing to a coaching staff where your head guy's on the hot seat type of thing. That I do think with Turner, I mean, at least he's now going to be linked as the first, if you will, with it throughout that entire cycle. But I mean, going forward here, hopefully the first of many for Matt Rule and company to get in place here. So.
Yep. And I mean, the early returns along the recruiting trail, just speaking about conversations I've had with high school coaches and other people, I think a lot of the coaches are appreciative that Rule has been focusing a lot of the in-state, schools and recruits because, yes, you got to have that national view. Nebraska has to recruit nationally, and there's a lot of talent, just within that 500-mile radius or the other recruiting hotbeds that they've been focusing on. But the relationships for the long term is something that Rule has been focusing on. You see that he visited 3 Lincoln high schools in his first week on the job. He's been out in Omaha. He's been calling coaches all over the state. So that goes a long way.
Starting in the backyard. And it's, I mean, it is neat to see. You see Matt Rule on Twitter. He's going up to Norfolk. He's going out to Scottsbluff and the Panhandle and stuff. You see him playing ping pong with Maverick Noonan's mom. Obviously, all these in-home visits with it, at least right away. And I'm sure you can attest to this too with him. At least everything is pointing that he's hitting all the check marks, and I mean, especially building those relationships that are really going to help not only with coaches but school administrators, family. That stuff's all going to have a trickle down effect here in the next few years. At least is the hope from their standpoint.
Yeah. No, without a doubt. I mean, this stuff doesn't guarantee that you're going to land any specific recruit. It's just about doing things the right way, or
and setting a foundation more than anything.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And you look at kind of the long-term view, of course, of where they're recruiting. Running backs coach E.J. Barthel, he's been the guy recruiting the East Coast, particularly New Jersey, kind of Pennsylvania, the northeast corridor of the country. Defensive line coach Terrence Knighton and defensive backs coach Evan Cooper have been recruiting heavily in Texas. And those are the areas. I mean, Rule said it in his introductory press conference. I mean, New Jersey, Texas, 500-mile radius. You can go to Florida, you can go to the South, whatever, but they're really looking at Texas. A lot of Texas recruits have been offered in that northeast corridor where Barthel's familiar with.
Well, you look at Rule's footprint, especially from the Baylor ties, that obviously the Texas comes as a no-brainer, but even going back to something Mickey Joseph said multiple times over the last few weeks of the season, you've got to go get guys to have them come here. You got to build those footprints, whether it's Texas, the Northeast, the Southeast for that matter. Especially for Nebraska, you need, like we touched on, that 500-mile radius, the in-state kids. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you've got to go find the athletes, go find the diamond in the rough. And I know Rule, you hear about the pedigree of being able to develop kids. The hope is you can bring some of those kids late in the early signing period, get them signed, bring them up here, and then see what they turn into over the next few years here. So
yeah, definitely. I mean, these early returns, I think just show the long-term strategy. But in regards to this 2023 class, Friday is a very big day. And in particular, I mean, the weekend, it depends how long the players can stay. But it is an official visit weekend, not just at Nebraska, but across the country. Recruits are going to campuses. They're going to see the facilities, talk with coaches, meet the other recruits too. It's very, very important just in regards of building those relationships, the guys who you already have committed, making sure they're locked in. And of course, a lot of big targets, guys that are still uncommitted, will be in attendance. So just a brief rundown. I'll have a full story, journalstar.com. You can check out all the different recruits visiting, but 6 of the current commits will be in attendance, including all 4 of the in-state guys, Sam Sledge, Gunnar Gatula, Brock Knutson, and Maverick Newton. Wide receiver Jaden Doss and linebacker Dylan Rogers will also be there. But we look at these targets, and this is kind of the question you have. You get these guys in the building. It's very important. First week, I mean, some of these guys have a lot of options where they could go. So going to Nebraska on this first week, I think it shows there's a lot of interest there. Malachi Coleman, as you mentioned, wide receiver Jalen Lloyd from Omaha West Side, and another West Side kicker, Tristan Alvano. 3 of the in-state guys. Let's just start there. I mean, Coleman, everyone knows him. He's a big fish. He was committed. As I mentioned, he has those options. He'll explore those. But Lloyd, within the first 24 hours, he got that offer. And it's the same thing as Turner. Lloyd had it down to a top 4 track schools that he was thinking he was going to commit to. All of a sudden, that commitment ceremony gets bumped off. He gets this football offer, and now it's decision time. I mean, does he want to play football?
Well, and I mean, I guess to group Alvano into that too, and obviously Coleman's a little bit of a different situation with him being here, decommitting, and still the future being up in the air. This weekend, now granted, these coaches are making their rounds. They're going to do the in-home visits. Even speaking to Dylan Rogers, you see the staff meeting with him on Twitter and pictures showing up. This is their real first chance to make that strong first impression with that big official weekend visit. You're going to have all these kids together. I mean, you know it in a lot of these situations, it's a domino effect of these kids. Yep. What are they seeing? What's the vision of this program going forward? Lloyd, Malachi, Tristan Alvano in that group. You want to stay in your backyard, or do you want to see what else is going on? And obviously, you look at a kid like Malachi, you've got Deion Sanders just taking over at Colorado. You're going to have all these other coaching hires that coaches are going to be in that speed mode to go out and see a kid like that. Now, Lloyd's the interesting one, and especially for me watching him at state track this past spring, the raw athleticism that kid has, especially jumping-wise, sprinting. When you've got a coaching staff that prides themselves on development, if you have someone that has that type of intangibles, at least on paper, that you can bring in, options are endless of what you turn that kid into, and especially at wide receiver, looking for any threats that you can get on the field. It's a big target, and like you said it yourself, with his ceremony, kind of that situation getting bumped, you obviously know Nebraska's got to at least be one of the front runners and in the picture, that this is the chance for Nebraska staff to really deliver the seal of approval on the kid. And you would hope if Lloyd commits here, maybe his Westside teammate would like to follow in the footsteps with it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in regards to Alvano too, Cole's Kicking, which is the biggest like national
kicking camp,
like recruiting service for kickers or punters, they have Alvano ranked as the number 6 guy in the nation for the class of 23. So you get an in-state guy like that, I mean, you really got to lock him down is the goal. And initially, Nebraska's kind of strategy under Mickey Joseph was they had, offered him a scholarship in the future. If he can come in, win the starting job, they say, hey, we'll give you a scholarship. Then all of a sudden, Alvano kicks 5 field goals in the Class A title game, 45-yard game winner, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, you got that scholarship offer. We don't want you to leave. So kind of the equation for Alvano now is transfer portal. Are there any big schools that lose a kicker all of a sudden and they need to go, refill him from the high school ranks, get a kicker with plenty of potential? So he's been in discussion with quite a few schools, but knowing that he has that scholarship offer from Nebraska, big recruiting visit weekend, we'll see if he's able to kind of discern where he's at, but his process will take a few more weeks to play out, I think.
And you and I have talked multiple times, scholarship offers, especially what he has, don't grow on trees for kickers, obviously. Yep. And obviously the state championship game performance is one thing, but you look throughout the year, both the accuracy and the distance that the kid has in his leg. It's no surprise he's rated as high as he is, and as many schools are interested. And, I mean, Nebraska, over the past few years, kicker's been a little bit of a revolving door, if you will,
you could say that.
And that might be a little bit of an understatement there. But with Tristan Alvano looking at the potential opportunity that's in front of him, especially with the amount of kickers that have left here at Nebraska here in the past couple weeks to hit the portal, I mean, it's definitely got to be an interesting decision, and the chance to stay at home. Now, granted, each kid has his own stuff he's going to look for in the recruiting process, but I'll be he's one of the more interesting cases for me of their potential recruits they're looking at this weekend. So
definitely. And just briefly to run through some of the other out-of-state visitors, running back target Quentin Ives. He's a Barthel recruit. He'll be here. Former Nebraska commit Cameron Lenhart from IMG Academy. He's back. He got reoffered. He's still in the mix. Gotta love recruiting where stuff like this happens, where he's committed, he's decommitted, could commit again.
The fun ones are the ones that flip their commitment 2 or 3 times and then end up at 3 schools over the course of their college career.
Yeah. And another big one, too, by the way, tight end Andrew Metzger, he'll be here for an official visit. He's the teammate of current Nebraska commit Hayden Moore, linebacker for Regis Jesuit in the Denver area. That's a big one because Nebraska doesn't have a tight end in this class right now after Bramer decommitted. So they'll see if they're able to land him. And then 3 different portal targets will be in town. Defensive end Elijah Judy, Texas A&M transfer. He was a 4-star recruit, redshirted last year. A lot of potential for him. Offensive lineman Johnny Cornelius, one of the highest rated offensive tackles in the entire nation. Look this up today. Ranked number 6 by PFF as the best lineman, or best tackle, I should say, last year, ahead of the all Big Ten guys like Peter Skoronski from Northwestern, Paris Johnson from Ohio State. So he's a big target, especially when the quality of offensive linemen in the portal is pretty limited.
Well, and especially if you look at what Nebraska on paper, now granted, it's interesting with the amount of kids that either dealt with injuries or freshmen coming into the program offensive line for going into next year. And obviously there's no guarantees everyone will be back, but you look at the potential, and we got news with Donovan Raiola, obviously, in regards to the staff at that position, that at least, once again, we're going to go back to this, but knowing what's in place from a position coach standpoint will make an impact this weekend. But it's definitely, whether he comes here or not is one thing, but the fact to see Nebraska in the discussion has got to be a promising sign for other transfer targets this offseason too. So,
And the last portal target, this is an interesting one that we learned today. Quarterback Jeff Sims, Georgia Tech transfer. He will also be attending this official visit weekend, which, again, this is not a case of where, he's visiting. He's definitely going to commit. Sims will have a lot of other schools that are interested in him. But I think it's an important one because you look at how Nebraska's quarterback situation is right now. 5 scholarship quarterbacks, but the big Casey Thompson, is he coming back? How's his health? It's hard to say. And given the way that the backup quarterback situation unfolded over the rest of the year, it would be smart for Nebraska to bring in a new quarterback regardless. But Sims, that's a guy who's been a starter. That's not necessarily a guy who's coming in with the expectation of being a backup.
Well, and the experience factor of that too. Now, granted, Casey's status is still up in the air for next year, but you could just equally as much put a question mark over the Logan Smothers, Chubba Purdy, what the rest of that quarterback room looks like. And if you're a Richard Torres or someone else in that room that sees the writing on the wall of the guys that are ahead of you, there's no guarantee that your scholarship quarterback number might drop a little bit more over the course of this offseason. We saw it. Putting the ball through the air was a struggle, to say the least, when Casey wasn't here. If you can get a guy, now, once again, you said it yourself, he's not coming here with the expectation of being a backup, but if looking at this past season for Nebraska, you see the opportunities are going to be there for a kid coming in here. So it's he'll have other options for sure. We'll put it that way. Yeah. But at the same time, once again, just to have him here for the weekend, potentially leave that impression, it bodes well for Nebraska's staff. So
yeah, what I'll be interested to see is, because there's a very plausible scenario where, say, in a month from now, Casey Thompson has surgery and he decides, hey, I'm just going to hang it up. If Nebraska hadn't made those connections, if they hadn't hosted quarterbacks, they could be screwed at that point. So this move to me is maybe an insurance move, or maybe just an indicator that the staff really likes Sims.
Well, and another wrinkle to throw in there, you look at this staff that's in here. None of them have a familiarity with Nebraska's current quarterbacks. Sure. None of them recruited them. They didn't bring Casey in through the portal. Obviously, there's not that sense of attachment to the guys that, if whether it's Sims or anybody else for that matter, if there's a guy that they like, never say never on some of these kids. And at the same time, at the other end of that, never say never. Some of their current quarterback options are going to hit the door. So
definitely. Well, this is only just part of the recruiting craziness. Just want to touch on staffing very briefly. Just in today, a couple hours ago, Nebraska's hiring former Syracuse defensive coordinator Tony White for the open defensive coordinator position. That's a national report. And that's an interesting one, because we've seen with Matt Rule's assistant coaching hires, been very, very focused on guys he's worked with, guys who have been recruiters, and White fills the recruiting aspect of things. He worked as the recruiting coordinator at San Diego State for 6 different years, but you look at his experience, he was at Arizona State, defensive coordinator there. Syracuse, been the DC for the last 3 seasons. So a guy who's not been a real associate, but kind of still fits the mold of what
Yeah,
he's
and
looking for.
he's been around the block, I guess we could say, with it. And I mean, especially you look at the past regime with it, and this staff for that matter. With a lot of these assistant coaches, there's so many unknowns. Now, granted, they might have, even look at a Mark Whipple coming in last offseason. They've got the track record, they've got the pedigree. But to Nebraska fans and people that haven't paid attention, that aren't watching Syracuse on a weekly basis with it, you don't really have that full feel for the guy yet. That it'll be interesting. Like you said, it does fit the mold of what you can at least tell from the outside looking in of what Rule's trying to get in place with his assistants here. But this one came a little bit out of left field, I guess you could say, to some. So
Yeah, and young assistant coaches
Yes.
is something he's looking for too.
especially on the recruiting trail.
Yeah, White, by the way, 43 years old. So yes, he fits that mold. Wide receiver coach still not officially filled. We'll wait on that. As you mentioned, Donovan Raiola appears to be staying on as offensive line coach, and then 2 more hires that have been reported, not officially confirmed by the university, but Jake Pete's likely to be quarterbacks coach, and Rob Dvorak likely to be linebackers coach. So we'll look forward to the official confirmation on all those and see who he brings in as wide receiver coach. But the other big aspect, as I mentioned, the transfer portal, been going crazy.
The gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the COVID year of eligibility, all the extra things going on. 1,000 entries in the portal since things open. No, that's not just from Nebraska. That's everybody nationwide. 14 entries for Nebraska in the portal. We've got all the stories up on journalstar.com, but 4 kickers, quite a few offensive and defensive linemen. This is something you see across the nation, a lot of those positions. But in particular, I think some of the ones to focus on, Dakotas Crawford, guy with a lot of potential, but Mickey Joseph recruit. It makes sense. Jaquez Yant, brought here, had a big game, never really translated. I mean, it makes sense why guys like that leave, but the one that had everybody shocked, freshman linebacker Ernest Hausman, Columbus native, pride of Nebraska, played it every game as his freshman year, and he hits the portal.
Well, and it's crazy. Like, I mean, you go back to the 2 you just touched on. Yant has that big game. He becomes the name around here, obviously being the big prototypical power back that doesn't hit the field that everyone thinks should be in there on every 3rd down in the Big Ten type of thing. You look at a Dakotas Crawford. I mean, it's probably best known for the heating and air commercial around the state.
May it forever live on.
But
yeah.
I mean, in his situation too, going back to his big of a name recruit, it left people hungry for more with the potential that never really came to fruition here. And obviously he was dealing with injuries and everything else along the way. But yes, Hausman is the big one. I mean, we go back to the Michigan game, and a bunch of us were writing after it that the Michigan game is obviously a little bit of a sign of the times of where Nebraska is currently at as a program, that looking ahead, Ernest Hausman is one of these building blocks toward the future. 3 weeks later, you don't know if Ernest Hausman's ever going to hit the field again in a Nebraska uniform. And it's, like you said, you've got that local aspect. You saw how much he really grew throughout the season. And I think that's what makes it hurt more.
Yeah.
Is, I mean, you had a kid that played the first couple weeks, rode the bench, and then just came back and, I mean, absolutely took the Big Ten by storm in a few of those games. I want to say the Michigan game, he had like 13, 14 tackles. Wisconsin, Minnesota, he made an impact in both of those games. And at least from the outside looking in, you got the impression he genuinely liked being here. He had that connection with Barrett Ruud, which, again, goes back to Barrett Ruud's going to be out the door. You don't know if what this kid is going to connect out with the new position coach, with the new coaching staff. And, I mean, once again, the door's still open, but at least all indications the grass may be greener on the other side for him with how he's looking at it right now.
Well, this is just the landscape of modern college football. It doesn't matter. You could find a diamond in the rough. You could find a guy who's no stars, no offers, no nothing. He has one big year, and suddenly, 20 schools want him. And that's not just something that Nebraska has. I mean, FCS schools, smaller FBS schools. I mean, it's just the case if you have a standout with years of eligibility remaining, it's very easy for them to find a better option in the portal.
Well, and on the other aspect of that too, I mean, there's Ernest Hausmans at every school around the country type of thing that are going to hit the portal. That, yes, at least on paper, you're going to have the local aspect. Columbus kid, he comes here, everyone's got that sense of attachment right away. But you might have the ability for Matt Rule and his staff to go out and get an Ernest Hausman type of player to come here, and not just at linebacker, but at other positions and fill those roles. So,
And the other ones too that I thought were kind of interesting: defensive back Jaden Gould, freshman, played the field a little bit. He's transferring, as well as edge rusher Jamari Butler. Again, played a little bit as a freshman. So those are the kind of guys where you're thinking, hey, they saw the field. Clearly, they've got some potential that the coaching staff has identified. You hope that experience, helps them build up at Nebraska, but instead they'll do it elsewhere. So,
and I would say Butler's another one of those kids that, I mean, kind of goes back to Hausman at the start, where you see the name keep popping on the depth chart. You hear the assistant coaches talking about him as a potential guy to emerge throughout fall camp, that you sit there throughout the season like, okay, the potential's here. We're going to potentially see this kid on the field, and he'll get out there and leave you waiting for more type of thing. But at the same time, you don't know his situation with how happy he is with the playing time aspect. That, I mean, I'm sure he wanted a bigger role than what he got at certain times of this season. So you never know the different factors that go into it. But there's definitely several surprises on this list, but I would throw him in that upper echelon, if you will. So.
Yep, for sure. Well, I think we've about exhausted ourselves running over all this football craziness, of course, touching on basketball and everything. So,
and we'll have 37 more portal entries next week.
Yeah, stay tuned for next week's episode.
Life in the portal.
I like it. I like it a lot. But yeah, I appreciate all of you tuning in today to hear a little bit of basketball breakdown. This will not be the last you've seen of Jordan. He will be back, of course, to break down the men's basketball season. Some big games coming up. They got that event. What do they call it? Locked in at the Vault?
The Battle of the Vault or whatever.
Yeah. That'll be an
next
interesting
Tuesday.
One, so. Yep. So some exciting times coming up in Husker athletics. Like I said, craziness happening every day in football. So stay tuned at journalstar.com for all the updates. But for Jordan McAlpine, appreciate all of you tuning in. I've been Luke Mullen. Thanks for listening to Life in the Red.